with bees to make sure this happens, and I'd be happy to meet with them.
Yes and yes.
We now consider Minister Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In 2019, the Scottish Government took shipbuilding company Fergus Marine into public ownership. The yard was supposed to deliver 2 ferries by the end of 2019 at a cost of £97 million. The ferries still haven't been delivered, and the total cost has ballooned to more than double the original budget, leaving islanders without new ferries and taxpayers footing the bill. As we've just heard, now, rather than using the shipbuilder to build more ferries, they are sending the contracts abroad to create jobs in other countries. So does the Secretary of State think this represents value for money for Scottish and UK taxpayers? And if he doesn't, will he raise this issue with Scottish ministers, because taxpayers really do deserve better?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point. The Scottish Government's incompetence in this area has cost the taxpayer very, very heavily indeed. 11 organisations responded to the original procurement process, and the 3 chosen to tender were shipyards in Romania, Poland and Turkey. And, Mr Speaker, I would have preferred the Scottish Government to show some loyalty to UK shipyards, even if their own one couldn't fulfil this contract.
Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This Government is continuing to work collaboratively with counterparts in the devolved administrations on issues affecting seed potato growers. We remain in close contact with the main industry bodies, and we continue to press the European Commission to allow imports of our high-class seed potatoes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The EU continues to block seed potato exports into Europe. It offers no reciprocal trading arrangements. And, of course, this is harming not only the vital industry in Scotland, but also my growers, Solana Seeds in North Norfolk. Will my right honourable friend agree to meet with me to explain the situation further and what we're doing to rectify this problem?
I'd be very happy to meet my honourable friend, Mr Speaker. I can tell him that an application has been submitted to the EU to lift the restrictions based on recognising GB seed potato requirements as equivalent, which has been pursued at both political and technical levels. We remain committed to finding a solution to allow exports to resume, and will continue to press our case with the Commission. In the meantime, the temporary authorisation that allowed imports of seed potatoes from the EU expired on the 30th of June.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, this is basically just another example of the botched Brexit deal failing to take into account the needs of a small but very important industry. The industry is now completely collapsed. 30,000 tonnes of seed haven't been exported. £13.5 million of trade is no longer in place. What is the Minister doing to actually ensure that an equivalence deal is reached with the EU as soon as possible so that the trade can be resumed?
Well, Mr Speaker, in addition to the points I made in the answer to my honourable friend, I would point out to the honourable lady that there is enormous export potential right round the world, particularly in China and Asia, further in Asia, for Scottish seed potato exports. This is something I discussed with industry in Glasgow on Monday evening. There is huge potential there, and we will do everything we can to help them realise that.
Sarah Britley.
Question number 5, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Our UK-wide total DWP spend on the labour market support will increase to more than £6 billion. This will give everyone a chance to progress work and develop the skills they need for the modern workforce. In Scotland, we have made available over 15,000 jobs, and around 8,000 jobs have already started.
Sarah Britley.
Well, to fulfil their potential is key to levelling up opportunity. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK-wide Kickstart scheme, which has made available well over 10,000 Scottish placements, is yet another example of the UK government delivering for the people of Scotland?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and if I can loop this back to earlier questions on labour market issues, I hope that these schemes that this government is putting forward will help give the next generation the skills to fill these domestic vacancies.
Secretary of State Ian Murray.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, a proper plan for jobs, of course, would have Scottish renewables at its heart. There are 4 simple steps the Minister could take today to unleash this proper plan potential. Firstly, persuade the Treasury to create a pot dedicated to tidal energy in the 4th Contracts for Difference auction. Secondly, instruct Ofgem to reform transmission charges to stop disadvantaging Scotland. Thirdly, fund the energy interconnectors from the island generators to the mainland. And, of course, fourthly, back the Acorn carbon capture and storage project. These government decisions would not only transform the UK energy sector, but create a Scottish jobs legacy from COP26. So will the Minister demand that his Cabinet colleagues act now to create a proper jobs plan for Scotland?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He does raise the important issue that Scotland in particular has enormous potential in the renewable sector, particularly on Acorn. I can reassure him that project is not dead. It didn't get through to the first 2, but is the reserve project, and we will be working closely to make sure it is in a future one. We are, through my department, we are funding a number of renewable energy schemes, like Core in East Ayrshire, and he referenced tidal in particular in the Orkney Islands. That can be form part of the island's growth deal. More generally, I'd be very happy to facilitate a meeting with my colleagues in Bays so he can discuss the wider issues.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would certainly accept a meeting with the Secretary of State at Bays to go over these issues, but I would have thought that the Minister and the Scotland Office would also want to champion these, because if one of the outcomes of COP is quite clear, it's we need action and not just words. Mr Speaker, the Chancellor's budget last week didn't have a plan for jobs in it either. In fact, he barely mentioned it. The conclusion, despite paying more, Scottish taxpayers are getting much less after a decade of devastating Tory and SNP austerity. It's no plan for jobs to be increasing taxes on businesses and hard-working people at a time when households and businesses are struggling with rapidly rising costs. So can I ask the Minister, is he comfortable, and is his department comfortable, as a Conservative Minister, that under his government, hard-working Scots now face the highest tax burden since the 1950s?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, firstly, on the income tax that the Scottish Government is responsible, it is indeed true that they have higher taxes than the rest of the UK, and I'll leave them to take that up with the Scottish Government. But on the wider point he made about unemployment and employment, if he casts his mind back to the budget last week, the forecasts for unemployment after the pandemic were originally for about 12%. It's going to be less than half that. Yeah. And through the changes my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, are making to universal credit tapers, for example, that will leave more money in the hands of hard-working people.
Ben Everett.
6, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Turing Scheme has provided funding for more than 40,000 participants from schools, colleges and universities across the UK to study and work around the globe during this academic year. Education providers in Scotland have received more than £8.2 million in funding under the schemes.
Ben Everett.
As one of 2 members of Parliament representing Milton Keynes in this place, I'm particularly proud that the scheme is named after one of our local heroes, Alan Turing. Can my right honourable friend and neighbour confirm to me that this scheme will continue to seek global opportunities for our students and hope that we can inspire the next generation of code breakers? And will he join me in welcoming the fact that there are 28 successful applicants for Scottish projects and £7.9 million for those Scottish projects this year?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I could absolutely agree with my honourable and close friend in Milton Keynes. It is a matter of pride that the scheme is named after Alan Turing, and the work that he did to help the globe, I think, is entirely fitting that our global scheme, which goes way beyond the horizons of Erasmus, is proving such a success. And I'm happy to confirm to him that in my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's budget announcement last week, the funding will be provided to deliver this scheme for another 3 years.
Greg Smith.
7, sir.
Mr Speaker, I have frequent conversations with Cabinet colleagues about maintaining and strengthening the devolution settlement and ensuring that the Government's focus is on delivering for Scotland. It is important that all legislation clearly reflects the competence and roles of Scotland's two parliaments and two governments.
Reg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the key issue here is for the Scottish Government to exercise its existing powers more effectively rather than asking for new ones or seeking to go outside the realms of the Scotland Act?
As my honourable friend will know, we routinely engage with the Scottish Government regarding the use of devolved powers. It is in the interests of citizens across the UK that both governments operate within their respective powers as set out in the Scotland Act 1998. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I flagged to the Deputy First Minister back in March that I felt the UNCRC and the ECLSG bills contained sections that were outside the competence of the Scottish Government. Sadly, our warnings and suggestions for changes to the bills were ignored, and so our law officers referred the relevant sections of the bills to the Supreme Court. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court agreed with our view on every count. I hope that the Scottish Government will, in future, work with us to ensure that their bills respect the devolution settlement so that we do not waste any more time and money when enacting important legislation.
Mr. Speaker.
This government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to transitioning the economy to net zero by 2050. We recently published our net zero strategy, which will support hundreds of thousands of well-paid jobs and leverage up to £90 billion of private investment by 2030 across the entire UK.
Communities must be local as well as large-scale projects such as turbine manufacturing that Scotland is sadly missing out on. But local communities such as my own in East Lothian are denied a share of the wealth flowing ashore. There's a legislative gap to allow community benefit for onshore as opposed to offshore as opposed to onshore wind. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss this to see if East Lothian and other such communities can benefit from offshore wind, as Shetland has benefited from oil and gas?
Well, I'm always happy to meet the honourable gentleman, but I would point out to him that this government is investing heavily in offshore wind, including announcements made this week by my right honourable friend.
David Owen.
Speaker, clearly Scotland has a lot to offer, not least in its high-quality wind. The net zero objectives. But can my honourable friend confirm that the Acorn, CCUS and hydrogen project is still very much part of the UK Government's plans for overall CCUS strategy and our objectives to meet net zero?
The short answer is yes. As I explained a moment ago, it wasn't successful to be in the first two, but it is a reserve project, and we are actively working to make sure it is there in future rounds.
Monaghan, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 97% of Scotland's electricity comes from renewable sources. This sector's expansion is hampered not by potential, but by the highest grid connection charges in the UK. COP is an opportunity to reassess such arrangements. So what discussions has he had with Cabinet colleagues on reducing these connection charges?
Well, I regularly meet Cabinet colleagues to discuss these matters and will continue to do so. What I would do is point out the investment my department is making in renewable energy right across Scotland, like the core renewable heat project in East Ayrshire, the tidal energy in offshore wind in Shetland. We are making real investment that will make a real difference to the people's lives and the planet.
Right. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. And I start with Dr. Rupert Huck.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, as the House will be in recess next week, I'm sure that colleagues will join me in looking ahead to Armistice Day and remembering those men and women who have served and lost their lives in the service of this country. We also thank the members of our armed forces who continue to do so today. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Rupert.
The Prime Minister's been busy preaching urgency this week at COP26. I hope he caught up with his sleep. But when he sits down with his grandchildren one day and they ask, what did you do that week of COP26? Would he be able to undertake one action in his gift that would have an immediate impact? Would he be consistent with what he's always said and done and take on the biggest emitter of CO2 in the whole of Europe that greedily, voraciously wants more? Will he ditch his predecessors, damaging, daft, pre-levelling up, pre-Zoom, pre-90% drop in demand, and have a fresh vote in this House to kill off the third runway at Heathrow?
Mr. Speaker, what this government is going to do, rather than taking steps to damage the economy of this country, what we are going to do, which is what Labour would do, what we are going to do is get to net zero aviation, Mr. Speaker. That's the future for this country. Clean, green aviation. And by the way, I think that has every chance of arriving a lot earlier, Mr. Speaker, than a third runway at Heathrow.
James Wilde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share my right honourable friend's commitment to build back better, to build back greener and to level up. And I have a project that will deliver on all those things, rebuilding the ageing Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn. I've shown him the pictures of the 200 props holding up its decaying roof. So will the Prime Minister make the Queen Elizabeth one of the 8 new schemes giving people in Norfolk, Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire the hospital they need?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my honourable friend does a huge amount of work for his constituents. I have seen the pictures that he describes, and I can tell him that the application is in from the hospital in his constituency. It is under consideration, and we aim to make our final decision in the spring of next year.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I share the opening words from the Prime Minister regarding our armed forces and the tremendous work they do, and also send my best wishes to all those recovering in Salisbury, and give our sincere thanks to the emergency services that responded on that day. And I'd also like to wish all those celebrating tomorrow a happy and peaceful Diwali. Now, let me start with something on which there should be agreement across all sides of the House. The independent standards process found that a member broke the rules on paid lobbying. Surely the Prime Minister accepts that this is and should be a serious offence. Yet we have seen reports that he will respond by scrapping the independent process and overturning its verdict. In no other profession in our country could someone be found guilty by an independent process and just have their mates vote them back into the job. Surely the Prime Minister and his government are not going to do that today.
No, Mr. Speaker, of course we're not going to do that, because paid lobbying, Mr. Speaker, paid advocacy in this House is wrong. And let me make absolutely no bones about that. And members who are found guilty of that should apologise and pay the necessary penalties, Mr. Speaker. But that is not the issue in this case, or this vote that is before us today. It is not. The issue in this case, which involved a serious family tragedy, Mr. Speaker, is whether a member of this House had a fair opportunity to make representations in this case, or whether as a matter of natural justice, our procedures in this House allow for proper appeal, Mr. Speaker. And that I think is something that should be of interest to members across this House, Mr. Speaker, and should be approached properly in a spirit of moderation and compassion, Mr. Speaker.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, let me put this to him simply. If it was a police officer, a teacher, a doctor, we would expect the independent process to be followed and not changed after the verdict. It's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. Mr. Speaker, when a Conservative member was found guilty of sexual harassment but let off on a loophole, they said the rules couldn't be changed after the event. So they can't change the rules to stop sexual harassment, but they can change the rules to allow cash for access. So why is the Prime Minister making it up as he goes along?
Mr. Speaker, all the professions that she mentions have a right of appeal, Mr. Speaker, and that is what the House needs to consider. And may I respectfully say to her that I believe that she needs to focus, instead of playing politics on this issue, which is what they are doing. I think that she needs to consider the procedures of this House in a spirit of fairness, Mr. Speaker. And we on this side of the House, instead of playing politics, we are getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, Mr. Speaker. 40 more hospitals, 20,000 more police officers, wages up, growth up and jobs up across this country. Those are our priorities.
Order. Mr Perkins, I don't want to say any more of that either. Right. Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't about playing politics in this place. This is about playing by the rules. And as we can see, it's one rule for everybody else and one rule for the Tory Conservatives. When they break the rules, Mr. Speaker, they just remake the rules. And I know that Donald Trump is the Prime Minister's hero, but I say to the Prime Minister, in all seriousness, he should learn the lessons that if you keep cheating the public, it catches up with you in the end. Because while they're wallowing in sleaze, the rest of the country faces higher bills, rising costs and damaging tax rises. So I ask the Prime Minister, can you tell us what is the projected tax increase per household over the next 5 years?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell her is that the recent budget did was take cash from those who can afford to pay the most, and it had very substantial tax cuts for the hardest working and poorest families in this country. We cut £1,000, Mr. Speaker, with the universal credit taper relief cut for hard-working families in this country. 2 million families had a £1,000 tax cut, and we're lifting the living wage across the whole country, Mr. Speaker. And what we are also doing, Mr. Speaker, is ensuring that this country gets on with a high-wage, high-skill, jobs-led recovery. And never let it be forgotten that if we listened to them, we would have none of those things, Mr. Speaker, because we'd still be in lockdown.
Lorena!
Mr. Speaker, I think he missed out the number, so let me help him out. The Resolution Foundation found that by 2026, taxes will be £3,000 more per household since he took office. My constituents and his constituents are feeling the pinch, and they're worried about Christmas as well, Mr. Speaker. Their bills are going up every week, and the budget did nothing to help them. So can the Prime Minister tell them how much was the tax cut that he gave to the banks instead?
Mr. Speaker, as she knows very well, it is the banks and the bankers who are paying far more proportionally as a result of our tax measures to cover the cost of the NHS. And actually, it's a very moot point, because the £36 billion came from 50% of it comes from the 14% who are the richest in this country, Mr. Speaker, overwhelmingly from the banks and financial services industry who can pay the most. And the astonishing thing, Mr. Speaker, is when it came to voting for that £36 billion increase in 48 new hospitals, in 50,000 more nurses, in looking after our public services, they voted against it, Mr. Speaker.
Angela Rayner.
£4 billion in tax cuts to the bankers and £3,000 of tax rises per household. Good news for the donors who gave his party £500,000. His bank got a bonus of nearly £8 million. But not so good news for the rest of us, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, this month, as the Prime Minister said, we remember and celebrate all those who serve our great country, and all those who have lost their lives, leaving behind loved ones, and those who have sustained life-changing injuries and live every day with the consequences of their sacrifice. Yet hidden in the small print of the budget was a £1 billion cut to day-to-day defence spending.
Shocking.
So, Mr Speaker, will our servicemen and women face pay cuts, or will there be fewer of them with less support?
Mr Speaker, I think it's quite incredible that we're now hearing this from the Labour Party when they would have pulled us out of NATO and I think the right honourable lady actually wanted to abolish the army. What you've got, she wanted to abolish the army. The woman sitting next to her, Mr Speaker. What you've got in this government is a spending on defence which is the highest since the Cold War, the biggest uplift since the Cold War, and an increase that has restored confidence in this country around the world in our ability to defend not just our own shores, but to defend our friends and partners as well. And that is what this government is doing.
Angela Rayner.
Mr Speaker, he knows that I asked him about the annual defence budget, which his own budget documents show will drop by £1.3 billion. Yep. And I hear the Prime Minister's fine words. I'm from a military family myself, but I won't take party political lectures from him because too often the government's actions don't match their words. And Mr Speaker, I think of my constituent who fought in Afghanistan and yet was threatened with sanctions because he was unable to physically travel miles to the nearest DWP office. Shameful. The Prime Minister's tax cut for short-haul flights last week cost £30 million. That is 50% more than the government spends on supporting veterans' mental health each year. The charity Combat Stress has lost £6 million in funding this year, even as their calls to their helpline have doubled. So will the Prime Minister match our proposal to reinvest the £35 million saved from cancelled MOD contracts to support our veterans that surely deserve it?
Mr Speaker, it's because we've been able to run a strong economy and take our economy out of lockdown that we've been able to invest massively in the NHS. We've been able to lift spending on defence to record levels and to keep supporting our fantastic public services. That is what this government is able to do, Mr Speaker. And I must say I enjoy my conversations with her in spite of the insults that the party political points that she directs it towards us, Mr Speaker. And I may say, I don't want to cause any further dissension in the benches opposite, but I think you all agree she has about a gigawatt more energy, Mr Speaker, than the right honourable gentleman, her friend from Holborn and St Pack. I'm just putting it out there, but it's the same old Labour. No plan, no ideas. We're getting on, Mr Speaker, with delivering on the people's priorities. We're taking this country forward. Growth up, jobs up, wages up, productivity up. All they do, Mr Speaker, is play politics while we deliver.
Jack Brereton. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister and the Government for securing our fantastic Stoke-on-Trent levelling up funding. And if we're to truly level up opportunities and access to opportunities in Stoke-on-Trent, we must also improve our poor public transport. So would my right honourable friend agree to look at the possibility for bus franchising in the Potteries?
As my honourable friend knows, I'm a fanatic about buses. I will urge him to take up his. We're putting £1.2 billion more into bus funding, and I know that Stoke-on-Trent has applied. But can I suggest that he takes his suggestion up immediately with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport?
You come to SNP spokesperson in Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I also, as we look forward to Remembrance Sunday, commend those that served and the military services that protect all of us, the security services, for the job that they continue to do. Mr Speaker, Sir David Attenborough's powerful opening statement to COP26 told us that the journey to net zero means we must recapture billions of tonnes of carbon from the air. The Committee on Climate Change has been clear that carbon capture and storage is a necessity, not an option, to achieve the planet's net zero targets. This week, Scotland's world-leading climate targets have received widespread praise from, amongst others, the UN Secretary-General. Scotland is finding partners across the world to tackle the climate emergency. But in Westminster, there isn't even a willing partner to deliver the carbon capture project that was long promised. Scotland's North East has now been waiting weeks for a clear reason to exactly why the Scottish cluster bid was rejected. There have been no clear answers, not even clear excuses. So maybe the Prime Minister will answer the simple question: does he know exactly how much of the UK's CO2 storage the Scottish cluster could deliver?
Mr Speaker, I'm a massive enthusiast for carbon capture and storage around the whole of the UK. The Acorn project in Aberdeen remains, as he knows, on the reserve list. He should not give up. We will come back to this, and of course we want to make sure that we have a fantastic industry generating clean hydrogen around the country. He should not despair. In the meantime, we are supporting amazing Scottish plans to get clean energy from wind, from hydrogen, from all sorts of means, Mr Speaker. And I may say I want to thank the people of Scotland, and I want to thank the people of Glasgow for the way they helped to produce so far what I think has been a fantastically well-organised summit.
Ian Blackford.
Mr Speaker, it's bad enough that the Prime Minister rejected the Scottish cluster a week before COP. But what's worse, he clearly doesn't even know or understand what his government was rejecting. So let me tell him. The Scottish cluster bid would have stored 30% of the UK's CO2 emissions, and it would have supported the creation of around 20,000 jobs in green industries. It was by far and away the best bid, Prime Minister. If this decision was based on science alone, it would have been approved on the spot. It is obvious that this was a political decision in Westminster to reject it. With days left at the COP summit, will the Prime Minister now reverse his government's massive own goal when it rejected the Scottish cluster?
Mr Speaker, I'm trying to encourage the right honourable gentleman to be a little bit less gloomy about the prospects of this initiative. I understand exactly what he says, and what we're doing is working with the Scottish Government, and I thank the Scottish Government for their cooperation and all the support they gave to COP as well in the last few days and weeks, and what they're doing. We will come back to this, Mr Speaker. But what I may say is that I think what I think is working well is the spirit of cooperation between all levels of government in this country, and what doesn't work is confrontation.
Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. House prices are rising in East Devon, with the dream of home ownership becoming out of reach for too many local people. New build developments must be affordable, with protections in place to restrict the number of properties becoming second homes. The loophole which allows second homeowners to avoid paying council tax should be closed quickly to help local authorities. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and colleagues from across the South West to discuss this growing crisis across our region?
Mr Speaker, I know how strongly my honourable friend and other colleagues across the South West feel about this issue, and that's why we've legislated to introduce higher rates of stamp duty on second homes, and we will ensure that only genuine holiday businesses can access small business rate relief, Mr Speaker, but I'm happy certainly to meet with colleagues to discuss what further we may do to ensure that local people get the homes they need.
Bill Hanby.
Speaker, Scotland is vital for the UK's energy needs, both currently and in the future. It's also vital for future offshore capabilities and other low-carbon and renewable energies. Not my words, but those of the Minister for Energy, confirming that it is the rest of the UK that is dependent on Scotland, not the other way round. Does the Prime Minister not realise that his failure to invest in carbon capture and storage at St Ferguson, Grangemouth, and feeding the potential at Mossmoran in my constituency is regarded as an act of deliberate economic vandalism, casting himself less as Bond and more as Blofeld the villain for all of the COP26 world to see?
Mr Speaker, what the COP26 world can see is the astonishing achievements of Scotland and the rest of the UK in developing clean energy sources. And I've said to the right honourable gentleman, the leader of his party in Westminster, that we will come back to the Aberdeen. Sorry, forgive me, he's a member of a different party. Forgive me. substantially the same agenda, though, Mr. Speaker. We will come back to this, and what I found encouraging about the last few days is the spirit of cooperation and joint enterprise that I now detect that will enable us to deliver massive carbon cuts across this whole country.
Peter Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Darlington Station is receiving £105 million thanks to this government's plans to make it HS2 ready. I want to make sure that Darlington benefits from high-speed rail. So will my right honourable friend meet with myself and regional colleagues to discuss the eastern leg of HS2 and reopening the Leamside line to allow the whole region to be better connected?
Well, my honourable friend, I thank I thank you for everything he's doing for Darlington, and he should wait for the integrated rail plan to come out. But in the meantime, we are upgrading Darlington Station. There are plans in place, and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, announced £310 million of funding over the next 5 years to transform local transport networks in the Tees Valley.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister says he is a fanatic of buses, but what about trains, and not just in Darlington, but the mention of the Leamside line? Because last Wednesday I was notified that a joint bid to reinstate the mothballed Leamside line had not been successful in attracting the next stage of the feasibility funding from the government as part of the Restoring Your Railway Fund. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what specific plans does the government have to invest in the North East, in places like Gateshead and South Tyneside in my constituency, and when is he going to get serious about levelling up in our communities instead of just using the term as a meaningless populist slogan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, she must wait for the integrated rail plan, but the North East will be the beneficiary of the biggest investment in our rail infrastructure beyond HS2 that we've seen for a century. About £96 billion more that we are going to be putting in, and what we want is we want the local authorities, we want the regional authorities to work with us to ensure that we promote the projects that the people really want.
Andrew Letts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you again. I want to really thank my right honourable friend for his support for the Early Years Healthy Development Review, and in particular for the £500 million of new money at Spending Review last week. My right honourable friend often says that talent is spread equally across our country, but opportunity is not. So does he agree with me that giving every baby the best start for life is the best possible way to level up across our country?
Yes, I thank, because I've listened to my right honourable friend over many years on this issue, and she is 100% right in what she says, about the importance of early years. And that's why we're investing £500 million to support families and children, including £82 million to create a network of family hubs to bring together services for children of all ages. And we're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to invest in children's early years. For example, the 15 hours of early education for disadvantaged 2-year-olds that's already benefited 1.1 million disadvantaged kids since 2013.
Session Lomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was recently contacted by a Vauxhall constituent whose mother tragically committed suicide after criminal domestic abuse by her husband, with the inquest into her suicide finding his actions to be direct cause. Incredibly, her abuser now stands to inherit her pension and entire estate because she was unable to complete divorce. This has left the family devastated, and I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending them our condolences. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that convicted domestic abusers should never be able to profit from the crimes of their victims? And will he meet with my constituent and me to fix this hole in the law?
Mr. Speaker, she describes a truly tragic and appalling case, and I'm sure the whole House will share the revulsion that she's expressed at the outcome of the law's processes. I think we will certainly need to have a meeting in order to see what we can do to address this loophole.
Mr. Speaker, NHS staff performed magnificently in the pandemic, but there are now severe shortages in nearly every specialty. So will my right honourable friend support an amendment to the Health Bill backed by 50 NHS organisations, every Royal College, to require Health Education England to do regular independent forecasts of the numbers of doctors and nurses that we should be training, so that we can reassure people, despite the pressure today, we are at least training enough doctors and nurses for the future.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we've got to make sure our NHS has the staff that it needs, and that's why there are 50,000 more healthcare professionals in the NHS this year than there were last year, 12,000 more nurses, Mr. Speaker, and in addition there are 60,000 nurses in training. Mr. Speaker, as somebody asked opposite, why are there waiting lists? Because we've been through a pandemic, Mr. Speaker, and what we're doing is fixing those waiting lists with £36 billion of investment, which that party opposite voted against, Mr. Speaker.
Walton Day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a little over a year since I last challenged the Prime Minister over his campaign promises to the 1950s-born women, in which time he has done hee-haw about their pension injustices. So can he tell me today, does his government have any plans to deliver justice for the women involved?
Mr. Speaker, this is a very difficult issue, as the whole House knows, and the case of the WASPy women is not easily addressed. As the honourable gentleman knows, the expenditure involved is very considerable, and the tax that would have to be raised would be very considerable. But we continue to reflect on all the options to ensure that people across this country get fair pensions.
Jill Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a mother, I cannot begin to imagine the pain and torment of losing a child. Richard Lee, a constituent of mine and veteran who served with distinction in the British Army, has been living with this pain every day of his life since the 28th of November 1981. On that day, his daughter, Catrice Lee, went missing from a military shopping complex near Paderborn in Germany. It was Catrice's second birthday, and her family are still searching. The 40th anniversary of Catrice's disappearance is coming up at the end of this month, which will undoubtedly be an exceptionally painful event for the entire Lee family. Would the Prime Minister please agree to meet with Mr Lee, father to father, and reassure him that Catrice has not been forgotten?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for raising this absolutely tragic case, and I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with Catrice Lee's family. And, of course, Mr Speaker, I will agree to my honourable friend's request and meet Mr Lee father to father.
Sarah Green.
The Epilepsy Society is a charity and world-leading research centre based in my constituency. They started the Epilepsy Climate Change Initiative to better understand the effects of global warming on epilepsy, and the impact is already clear. A recent survey showed that in hot weather, 62% of those whose seizures were uncontrolled experienced an increase in seizure frequency or severity. Will the Prime Minister join me in endorsing the Epilepsy Climate Change Initiative and commit to more funding to research the impact of climate change on human health?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. She raises a very interesting aspect of research into epilepsy. We're funding epilepsy research with another £54 million over the last few years, and this issue that she raises of any particular link between hot weather or climate change and epilepsy is certainly one that we will be going into.
Elliot Colburn.
Speaker, last week an independent inquiry into Lib Dem-run Sutton Council's own heat network found that it was set up on false assumptions, including funding that was never attained and homes that do not exist. And now my constituents are going to be left footing the bill. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this latest failure shows that they are just not fit to govern and that those responsible should go?
Well, Mr Speaker, it's not the first time that the Lib Dems have campaigned on homes that don't exist or will never exist. If I think of their campaign in Chesham and Amersham, Mr Speaker, but I will certainly look into the matter that he raises.
Bob Longfield.
Mr Speaker, in a recent ITV interview, the Prime Minister was asked about my constituent Jenny Garrett. Now, Jenny is a victim of the cladding scandal. Just before last Christmas, her building was evacuated because of safety concerns. She's been forced to pay £5,500 for a waking watch and alarms. She has to find £1,200 a year for car parking she can no longer access. The work needed to make her building safe is being blocked by the actions of her freeholder. She doesn't know the cost she'll face, but it's estimated at thousands of pounds. Yet, in his interview, the Prime Minister said Jenny had, quote, a frankly unnecessary sense of anxiety. So will he meet her to hear why she's worried and do so before the Building Safety Bill completes its passage through the House?
I'm afraid to say the honourable gentleman, I have every sympathy with his constituent, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly do. Mr. Speaker, I have every sympathy. I have every sympathy, but what I think is unfair is that people such as her are placed in a position of unnecessary anxiety about their homes when they should be reassured. And I think it is. I sympathise deeply with people who have to pay for waking watches and other such things. I think it is absurd. I think it is absurd, Mr. Speaker. But I think what people should be doing is making sure that we do not unnecessarily undermine the confidence of the market and of people in these homes, because they are not unsafe. Many millions of homes are not unsafe, and he should have the courage, Mr. Speaker, to say so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands has chosen to cut back on stop and search across the region. Can the Prime Minister confirm that while stop and searches must be proportionate and not discriminatory, they remain an important part of keeping our streets and our communities safe?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree with that, and it was a point that I raised recently with the Labour Mayor of London. We agreed on many things. He was very much out of line with the current Labour policy on lockdown, for instance, but he did certainly. I certainly thought that he was wrong about stop and search, and we need to make sure that stop and search is part of the armoury of police options when it comes to stopping knife crime. If it's done sensitively and in accordance with the law, I believe it can be extremely valuable.
Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, we can save the UK taxpayer £200 million and level up South London's health service. St Helier Hospital is set to lose its A&E, maternity, intensive care, children's service, renal unit and 62% of beds to healthy, wealthy Belmont at a staggering cost of £600 million. But there is an alternative. Rebuild St Helier, where health is poorest, and save £200 million. Now, it's not my job to help the Prime Minister sort out his budget, but wouldn't this be a good place to start?
Mr. Speaker, we are investing in 48 new hospitals and rebuilds. And what is her job? What is her job, quite frankly, is to vote for £36 billion of investment in the NHS, which will allow us to take our health services forward. Why wouldn't she do that, Mr. Speaker?
Robert Jenrick. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on his diplomatic efforts in recent weeks and ask him about another serious and grave issue that was raised at the G20 in Rome, the strong likelihood of a nuclear-ready Iran within a matter of weeks or months. What is the UK going to do with our international partners to tackle that? If it is via an agreement, will it be stronger and more enduring than the last one? And if it's not, as many people suspect, what is our plan B?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's in the overwhelming interests of the, and this is what we, thank you very much for his question. It's an issue he knows a great deal about. This is a case of making it clear to the Iranians that there is an opportunity for them to do something that I think would be massively in the interests of their people and of Iran, which is to come back to the table and do a further agreement, a son of JCPOA, restore the JCPOA at the Vienna talks. That is what needs to happen. That is the posture of the G20 and indeed of our friends and allies around the world.
Okay. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The universal credit cut is already hitting people hard. Even before the challenges of the pandemic, 39% of children in my constituency grew up in poverty. Now, Deptford First, a local charity I chair, has launched a fundraising campaign to support people through the winter months. The Prime Minister is well known for his abilities to attract wealthy donors to the party. Will he use those skills to boost our campaign? Or even better, will he cancel the cuts?
Mr. Speaker, what we've done with universal credit is abolish the old system that unfairly taxed people on universal credit and helped people with a £1 million tax cut, because what we on this side of the House believe in is rewarding work, Mr. Speaker. That's what the people of this country want to see. That's why we've put the tax cut on those who are on universal credit. That's why we're lifting the living wage, Mr. Speaker. And never, what's their policy on universal credit? No, it's not nothing. They want to abolish universal credit, Mr. Speaker.
Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Mayor of London is refusing to rule out the so-called Outer London charge, which would apply to all vehicles registered outside Greater London that cross the Greater London boundary. Now, this would have terrible consequences for my Orpington constituents, and indeed those people who live in the neighbouring constituency of Old Bexley and Sidcup. Now, Louis French, the excellent local candidate for the by-election, has pledged to fight this appalling proposal. Would my right honourable friend join me in wishing Louis French luck with this and to ensure that this silly move from the Mayor of London is stopped in its tracks?
I certainly do agree. I agree with my honourable friend, who is an old friend of mine. I've worked closely with him on London issues for many years, and I know where Labour's instincts are. They always want to put taxes up, particularly on motorists. And I think a checkpoint Chigwell would hit working families, Mr. Speaker. And what the Labour Mayor of London needs to do is get a grip on TfL's finances and stop whacking up the taxes on ordinary people in the capital city.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is very much aware of my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal, abducted by plainclothes officers while shopping with his new wife in the city of Jalandhar, Punjab on the 4th of November. The intervening years, Mr. Speaker, have seen allegations of torture overlooked and ostensibly strong words from his government about the case overshadowed by excitement over a trade deal with the Republic of India. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, as we approach the 4th anniversary of Jagtar's arrest tomorrow, with no charges having been brought in the case by the Government of India, would his government be able to grant the smallest of favours to Jagtar's wife and his family in Dumbarton and declare his detention an arbitrary one?
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for the campaign that he's been running for Jagtar Singh for a long time. And what I would say to him is that the closeness of our relationship with India in no way diminishes our willingness to raise that case with the government of India. And indeed, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, raised it only the last time she was in India.
Final question, Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the party opposite, I welcome the record investment in the NHS announced in the budget. Now, will my right honourable friend support my campaign for a new health centre in Rushcliffe, in the village of Eastleek, where the current building is no longer big enough to serve the current population, and they will soon need to accommodate 3,000 new patients from new buildings?
I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will do his utmost in the course of the coming decisions to oblige my friend in her campaign, justified campaign for Rushcliffe and its hospital. But, Mr. Speaker, how incredible that the Labour Party should continue to catcall and attack the government when they voted against the tax-rising measures that are necessary to fund our NHS. They are completely inconsistent, Mr. Speaker. They have absolutely no plans and no idea.
We now come to the statement. We now come to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Johnson.
Thank you. Thanks. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll make a statement about the G20 summit in Rome and update the House on COP26 in Glasgow. Almost 30 years ago, the world acknowledged the gathering danger of climate change and agreed to do what would